John, Paul, Eric, and Ringo. Meet the Beatles. No, that doesn't sound right, but it might have happened if Eric Clapton had replaced George Harrison as John Lennon proposed. By the time this idea was on the table, the Beatles had ceased to function as a group, but it's a tantalizing thought that in some alternate universe the British blues guitar virtuoso joined the most successful band of the 60s and helped repair the frayed relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. There is a similar alternate history where keyboardist Billy Preston joins as fifth member and the Fab Four, now the Fab Five, goes on to inevitable musical glory. Now, while Clapton and Preston contributed to some classic Beatle recordings, neither joined the group, which may have been past the point of saving anyway. But here's how Clapton's brush with the Beatle-hood went down. Eric Clapton first met the famous Beatles in December of 1964 at their holiday Christmas show in London, England. Clapton and his band, the Yardbirds, played backup act, supporting the iconic Beatles. The Fab Four promptly befriended Clapton, especially George Harrison, who eventually became his closest friend. And although Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership produced the vast majority of Beatles classics, George Harrison contributed many beloved songs to the catalog, including Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the latter recorded at EMI's Abbey Road Studios in London, featuring Clapton on lead guitar. During the summer of 1968, though, tensions were running high as the Beatles were attempting to record tracks for what would become known as the White Album, officially titled The Beatles. The band took a few stabs at While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but Harrison wasn't happy with the results. The lyrics didn't leave a lot of room for compromise. The song needed a strong lead guitar with a weeping sound, or it wouldn't work at all. Harris couldn't get it right, but he knew a guitarist who could. On September 6th, Harrison asked his friend Eric Clapton for a helping hand. He said, "We're going to record this song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and come on and play on it." Clapton responded, "Oh no, I can't do that. Nobody ever plays on the Beatles records." Harrison answered, "Look, it's my song and I want you to play on it." That night, Clapton laid down the guitar part and Harrison knew instantly that his friend had contributed just what the song needed. John Lennon couldn't make it to that particular session, so it turned out that Eric Clapton never actually recorded the entire Beatles band. The completed track has Eric Clapton on lead guitar, Paul McCartney on bass guitar and piano, Ringo Starr on drums, and George Harrison on vocals and guitar. And there's no John Lennon. Many of the band's inner circle conversations were recorded and were later documented to confirm the band's partiality for Eric Clapton. They were officially on record as being willing to have Clapton as a possible eventual replacement for George Harrison. It was somewhat of a no-brainer as far as they were concerned. John Lennon had reportedly said that George Harrison didn't return ready to carry on by that Tuesday. They would approach Eric Clapton to play in his pace. The Beatles were so sold on Eric Clapton that they were ready and willing to have him and were known to have said that they would give him full scope to play his guitar. John Lennon went even further by saying that he wanted the band to keep on playing regardless if Harrison continued with them or not. Not being the operative word in this sentence, the group had begun to tire of Harrison's involvement. That discussion, however, ended when then and there, in true Beatles fashion, the conversation ended in a jam session. John Lennon's statement is known just as his well-known episode of shooting off his mouth. He is often known to be overly dramatic and frequently overstated circumstances and situations. Even more interesting to note, however, is that this bold statement just may have been John Lennon's scare tactic to force Harrison's hand and call his bluff. It may have been an attempt to persuade Harrison to rejoin the group. It was Lennon's hope that his words would coerce and influence Harrison. Harrison returned to the Beatles 12 days later, making discussions about his replacement moot. Had Clapton and Harrison not been close friends, the drama might have created a rivalry, but George seemed actually to be closer to Eric than his own bandmates. The near replacement wasn't even the most famous instance of their friendship surviving a challenge. It involved the wife of George Harrison, Parity Boyd. Most of Harrison's love songs were inspired by Boyd, whom he married in 1966, including the line, "Something in the Way She Moves attracts me like no other lover." Years later, when Boyd and Harrison were still married, Clapton would pen one of his most famous songs to Boyd. "Layla, you've got me on my knees, Layla. I'm begging, darling, please, Layla. Darling, won't you ease my worried mind?" After Boyd and Harrison were married, they began having troubles due to alcohol and drugs, as well as Harrison's numerous affairs. It was during this time that Harrison became a close friend of Eric Clapton, performing and writing music with him. One day a letter was sent to Boyd where someone just signed it as E and declared his love for her. She assumed it was a secret admirer until she attended a party one night, and Eric, who she regarded as a friend, asked her if she received his letter. In 1974, Boyd separated from Harrison due to his endless infidelities, including with Ringo Starr's wife. Her description of the last year of her marriage with Harrison was fueled by alcohol and intolerable. Boyd had always refused Clapton's advances, and Clapton descended up into heroin addiction and deep depression. In 1979, Boyd decided to move in with Clapton and soon after were married. The honeymoon was over after a short time and they began having marriage troubles, and they were divorced in 1989. Through it all, Harrison and Clapton remained friends. They continued to work together, with Clapton appearing on Harrison's Cloud 9, 1987, and Harrison appearing on Clapton's Journeyman in 1989. Eric Clapton caught wind of the so-called proposition, and in 1998 he finally began speaking out regarding his thoughts on the entire idea. Needless to say, Clapton's speaking up had often triggered the media's attention. Never mind, although the media attention mostly relied on speculations, there might have been a suggestion that I was to be asked to join the Beatles in 1969. The problem with that was I had bonded or was developing a relationship with George exclusive of them. I think it fitted a need of his and mine that he could elevate himself by having this guy that could be like a gunslinger to them. Lennon would use my name every now and then for clout, and as if I was the fastest gun, so I don't think I could have been brought into the whole thing because I was too much a mate of George's. Relations amongst the band members became more relaxed, although they were still strained during the recording sessions for their final recorded album, Abbey Road. The LP included two of George Harrison's most respected Beatle compositions, Here Comes the Sun and Something, which became one half of the Beatles' first #1 double A-sided single, Harrison's first A-side, and the first of Harrison's song to reach the top of the charts. In 1969, Frank Sinatra recorded Something and later called it the greatest love song of the past 50 years. John Lennon considers Something the best song of the Abbey Road album, and it became the Beatles' second most covered song after Yesterday. According to author Peter Lavizello, Harrison would finally achieve equal songwriting status with his two classic contributions to the final Beatles LP. In April of 1970, when Harrison's For Your Blue was released in America as a double A-side with McCartney's The Long Winding Road, it became the band's second chart-topping double A-side, while For Your Blue became Harrison's second #1 hit. His increased productivity and the Beatles' reluctance to include his songs on their albums meant that by the time the group's ultimate breakup, he had amassed a stockpile of unreleased compositions. While Harrison grew as a songwriter, his compositional presence on Beatle albums remained limited to 2 or 3 songs, which served to increase his frustration and significantly contributed to the band's ultimate breakup. Harrison's last recording session with the Beatles was on January 4, 1970, when he, McCartney, and Starr recorded the Harrison song I, Me, Mine. For all the negativity surrounding George Harrison for his career as a Beatle, he went on to achieve his dream of releasing his beloved songs. In fact, the Beatles are unique in that each member went on to have extremely successful solo careers. George Harrison was not the only member of the Beatles to have walked away. As their notoriety grew, so did their egos and temperaments. Often band members would clash about musical, creative, and personal issues. Ringo Starr was known to have walked away after it all became too much. Internally, the group knew it was really over on September 20th, 1969, when John Lennon told his bandmates he was out. The Beatles did not publicly reveal the breakup until April of 1970, when Paul McCartney said in a statement that he was no longer working with the group. The press and the public took this as an official word that the Beatles were kaput, but the writing had been on the wall for a long time. Harrison had released his first solo album, the soundtrack of the film Wonderwall, in 1968, and Lennon had released an album of experimental music with Yoko Ono the same year. In 1970, before McCartney's statement, both he and Ringo Starr had solo albums in the can. The most commercially successful and musically influential band of the 60s had run its course.